who chose to do her residency in pediatrics at OHSU. So he now lives in Portland, and I think some of you have met him because he's reached out to a number of you. So naturally, when he reached out to me, first thing I said was, you need to come give a talk. And so that's why he's speaking today. Just a brief bio, and then I'll let him get started. He actually received his undergraduate degree actually at the same university that I did, although not in the same year. He received a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Engineering from the University of Illinois, and then a Master's in Human-Centered Design and Engineering up the road at UW. And then he went to UC San Diego as an NLM predoctoral fellow and successfully completed his degree.
Awesome. Thank you for the kind introduction. Yeah, I was really looking forward to getting to share some of my research here. It often seemed my experience that despite working in kind of the same group, I often wouldn't hear about what other folks were doing in other parts of the department or within bioinformatics. So I was really looking forward to this kind of cross-pollination opportunity to show some work that I did at UC San Diego, and also probably from a little different background from a lot of you, my focus being in more human factors and human-computer interaction. Just to get a feel for the room, how many of you are pre-doc fellows or just PhD students? Okay, so we've got a number of you, so I feel your pain. You can get through it. How many of you are on the more clinical informatics side of things? Okay, and I know some of you probably won't raise your hand for either of these, and you'll say, I do both, but how many of you are on the more computational side of things as well? Great. So. Exactly. So those who kind of straddle or do both. So hopefully my research will actually touch on a little bit of both of that. I had the opportunity to look specifically at computational notebooks, so this kind of new emerging medium that mixes documentation with either programming code or other things that you can do to take action or analyze or interact with data. So as was mentioned, I'm coming up here from UC San Diego. I worked with the Department of Biomedical Informatics there. I had my training with them. But I also received a lot of training from the lab I was primarily in, which was a group called the Design Lab, which is just a whole bunch of folks who come from all different kind of backgrounds. So we have clinicians, we have anthropologists, computer scientists, cognitive scientists like myself, who all study how people use information systems, how can we redesign them to make them easier to use or more productive for things like learning, education, conducting science. I want to start with a quote actually from my advisor, highlight here Jim Holland, who's been kind of a pioneer in information visualization. And he shared a quote with me just about kind of the nature of science that I found really compelling over my time. And I think it also reflects a lot of what I want to get at today. This is a quote by Sir Peter Medwar, who was a Nobel Prize winner and also a rather elegant writer, who said that the scientific method begins as a story about a possible world, a story in which we invent and criticize and modify as we go along, so that it ends by being, as nearly as we can make it, a story about real life. And I hope this resonates with a lot of you in research, where we're trying to figure out what's going on in the world. We collect data, we have a potential story of how we might explain that, but then we get more data and we update it. So kind of these two notions of it's a process of storytelling and trying to make sense of the data, but also one that we have to invent and criticize and modify as we go along. And we realize, oh, that wasn't quite right, but maybe this is. And really my research just makes a simple tweak on this phrase to say that the same can be said of data analysis, whether that's data analysis on research and doing computation and programming to analyze data, or data analysis that you might do in a clinical context, trying to make sense of a patient's case and what these values are telling you. And that this fact that data analysis is a storytelling process has implications for the interfaces that we design. So at a broad level, my research for the last several years has tried to answer this question of how might we make it easier for people to craft and to tell stories with data. And to kind of say why I think this is both important and difficult to do, I want to tell you a little bit about this paper. This paper is called Growth in a Time of Debt. It's an economics paper, so I think outside of all of our fields. But it was a rather impactful paper. It was published in 2010, and it sought to answer a rather broad but also impactful question: how does government debt affect economic growth? So this was in the time of austerity in Europe and euro crisis and trying to figure out, do we solve things post-economic crisis with a bunch of stimulus spending, or is that just going to hamstring our economy in the future by loading us up with a bunch of debt? So they collected data. The authors of this paper came up with this figure that countries that get over the 90% threshold of their GDP in debt average at best stagnation, at worst mild recession. And this was a huge result. It was talked about in the halls of government in Europe, by our senators here in the United States, and justifying budget decisions. The only problem was nobody could replicate this. Loads of people would read through the paper, they'd try and replicate the same result. They were just getting different figures. So it ended up that one group actually contacted the original authors and said, can you just send us the files you used for your analysis? And they said, sure, we're happy to share that. And when they did, the second replication group found that if they added some emitted data, changed how they did their averaging method, the weighting of different countries' data, and then fixed an error in Excel where they hadn't drugged the averaging function all the way down the data column, they got a much different figure of a rather healthy 2.2%. So I don't bring this up to make a economic argument of which is right or wrong, but just to make the point that when we separate the description of how we did an analysis and why we did it that way from the actual steps that you use to do it, you can lead to problems with interpretability, reproducibility. And it's been in the news a lot lately about crisis of reproducibility. And this, I think, reflects a broader challenge, that tracking and sharing data analyses, how we think about and work with data, is really difficult at a number of levels. Analyses are often iterative. You try multiple things over and over again until you find an explanation you think fits. Many analyses lead to dead ends. You try something that just doesn't work, and you don't want to document that. It just takes a bunch of time. It can be distributed across software platforms, so you might be using SAS or the platform I'll look at in a minute, Jupyter Notebook. But also have a Word document and a website and emails. And capturing that in one place and handing it off to someone or communicating it to someone can be challenging. And it takes professional judgment. Sometimes you just have to make a call. Do I log normalize this? Do I not? It's kind of in a borderline. And so communicating why you chose to do something in a particular way when it's in a gray area can be challenging. Now, before I go further into talking about interfaces to try and address this issue of communicating data analyses, I want to note that data analysis can mean a lot of different things, and I'll focus on one kind of narrow description of it at first, and then I'll broaden it up near the end to talk about clinical contexts. My favorite definition of data analysis comes from John Tukey. You may know Tukey's tests. He also had a book, Exploratory Data Analysis, where the introduction is just great. I recommend you all read it. And in it he says, data analysis is simply looking at data to see what it seems to say. And he talks a lot about plotting data by hand. That's difficult to do with our data sets now. But what I like about this definition is that it captures some of the breadth of data analysis. So it could be John Snow's hand plotting of the cholera outbreak in London to figure out where is it that these cholera cases are coming from. It can be the Excel analysis that we talked about a little bit earlier. Or what I'm going to talk about mostly, which is doing data analysis via programming. As the scale and scope of data we have gets larger than we can do by hand or interactive systems, doing it via programming is often how we do it now. And for the first bit of this talk, I'm going to talk a lot about this particular interface for data analysis called Jupyter Notebook. And just to get a sense for the room, how many of you have heard of or used Jupyter Notebook before? Great, so there's a number of you. Thanks, that helps with the contrast. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, yeah. For those of you not familiar with it, it's really just a programming environment where you have different blocks of code, or cells as they're called, that you can write computer code in a bunch of languages, Python, R, Julia, and have it execute and print the result in line. So in this particular notebook, they're importing external packages and libraries to do fancy plotting. They're implementing the parameters of a model. They're plotting this histogram of the data set before they do anything further with it. And so this really helps track your analysis, and you can iteratively build it up over time. At the same time, though, this is also what people would call a literate programming tool, where you can go in and put richly formatted text, images to describe why you did things a particular way, what other experiments that you tried. Just to give you a little bit further example, because I know the static view may not make sense, let's say I have a really simple analysis where all I want to do is plot a few XY data points and fit a line to it. I have a notebook here where I've made a title at the top, and then I've got a couple of cells of code, importing libraries, importing the data. And I can run these independently. So this will start in a second where I run this first cell, and then run the second one to pull in data, and then I'm going to plot the data. And then I have this sum squared error that I'm calculating. How well does this fit? And like other development environments, this tells me if I've typed something incorrectly or it can't understand. So I can quickly fix that, get my sum squared error measure, but then go back and say, well, what if I add, an x squared term to this curve that I'm plotting? Oh, that seems to visually fit better. Does it fit better this way when I calculate the sum squared error? And then you can just keep iterating back and forth on this until you get a result that you think fits the data set. But then there's also this second aspect of I can go in and document things. So I can begin saying, oh, be careful of overfitting. I can continue to increase the degree of the polynomial, and this number is going to get lower and lower and say I have a better fit. But if I just look at it, that doesn't seem to be an elegant explanation of the data set. And so this notion of mixing text in with your analysis is something that folks have called computational narrative. And the makers of this particular software describe it this way, that in order for data and the computations that process and visualize that data to be useful for humans, they must be embedded into a narrative, a computational narrative that tells a story for a particular audience and context. And this notion has really taken off. So there's this notebook in the middle I was showing you. The R ecosystem with RStudio has their own notebook environment. The Distill online machine learning journal now uses computational notebooks as a way of documenting and explaining really complex analyses. Just a couple weeks ago, Nature published an article about the increasing use of tools like the Jupyter Notebook software I just showed you. And my favorite article from The Atlantic earlier this year had this rather apocalyptic headline that says, "The scientific paper is now obsolete," trying to make the claim that in the future, no longer will we have just these static PDF documents describing our results, leading to problems like the one I discussed earlier with the economics paper. Now we're going to be documenting all of our data-driven analyses in these notebooks that mix the actual code that can be rerun with an analysis, the description of the analysis. And despite kind of the apocalyptic view, I think this is a compelling vision of how can we use interactive tools to make it easier to track, communicate, think about, and replicate analyses. So broadly, my research tried to look at how are these tools being used and how might we improve them? What are the benefits of this paradigm of kind of live documentation that mixes action and text, but also some of the drawbacks that we need to fix. And I think it'll have implications both for this specific tool that I look at, that's often used for research, it looks like many of you used, but also for clinical documentation, which we'll get to near the end. My specific question is really, how might we use these computational notebooks to help people track and share data analyses? And I'm going to try to talk through three questions that I addressed in my research. And I may jump a little bit over the second one just for sake of time. But first, I try to just see, how are these documents being used? Millions of people use them. There's a lot of hype around them, but how are people actually using them? Are they using them to clearly document their work or just to really quickly hack together some code? How might we tweak their design to make it easier to use them for this vision of clearly tracking and sharing analyses? And then how might we design them for people who don't program, for clinicians or engineers or government workers to benefit from mixing, taking action on data in with documentation describing why you're doing that? So then I have these kind of three broad themes of the research that I'll go through. And first talk about use of computational notebooks. And here I really wanted to look on this notion of narrative, that you can be able to mix your programming environment with this narrative description of what's going on. And wanted to see, is this what people are actually doing? So how much narrative operationalized in some way is there in a typical notebook? What about notebooks supplementing academic papers? This kind of creme de la creme vision of we're going to be able to distribute these and have reproducible research for all. And then how do analysts think about and use their notebooks, trying to explain why the data that we see from the first two questions is the way it is. So this led to three different studies, and I'll jump into the first one, analyzing over 1 million Jupyter Notebooks from GitHub. And before jumping into that, how many of you are familiar with GitHub as a platform? So again, a number of you. For those of you who aren't, it's a platform where typically programmers store files or code related to a particular project. And it has nice facilities for tracking versions of the code as you update it over time, or making it easy to collaborate. So a grossly oversimplified view is that it's an online file system that lots of people can access. And so here I'm showing a particular repository or collection of files that I had for a prototype medical records summarizer, and you can click through the files here at the top. What's interesting is this platform, GitHub, several years ago started rendering notebooks inline. So they would take the notebook kind of proprietary document format and render it inline so that you could easily share with a collaborator the notebook document. They could look through it without needing the notebook software downloaded on their computer. It was a great way to share these notebooks with others and share analyses that have some description of what's going on. Since the introduction of this feature in 2015, there's been a somewhat exponential growth in the number of notebooks on GitHub. Here I mean Jupyter Notebooks. And when I ran this study, they had just reached the 1 million notebooks threshold. So for my first phase of research, I downloaded all of these. Built a scraper, scraped all of these documents, and then just computed a bunch of features about this corpus of documents. So looking at how many cells or blocks of code and text there were, how many lines of code, words of markdown, what libraries they import, just dozens of things I looked at. And I don't have time to get into a bunch of the results. We have more documented elsewhere. But I think the most striking result came from one of the simplest analyses, which was simply, how long are these things, and what's the main content? So I'm going to show you a series of 3 graphs. On the left-hand side, I have the percent of all notebooks, the percent of all million in this data set. So 0, 5, 10 to 20. And then on the x-axis, I have a log plot of the length of the notebook via some measure. So here, the length and number of cells, discrete blocks of code, text that somebody had written. And we see a somewhat log normal plot, maybe about a dozen, 2 dozen cells, chunks in these notebooks on median. If we do the same kind of plot for the number of lines of code that are in the median notebook, we see something similar, log normal plot. But then there's this artifact onto the left, where there's a somewhat of a proportion, maybe 3%, that have no code whatsoever. This is kind of odd. This is really a programming environment. What's going on here? It turns out a lot of these are like index or table of contents notebooks. People use them to provide links to other notebooks. So they might have an analysis that spans 8 notebooks, and these are just their table of contents ones. What's really striking is if we look at the number of words of text, so that description that you get. And we see maybe a log normal bump off to the right, but then a huge chunk, over a quarter of these million notebooks, have no text whatsoever. And when we look at them, a lot of them are just loose collections of code that people have written and not really documented. So this is our first clue that, at least at scale with this data set, maybe these notebooks aren't being used for this narrative description, let me clearly describe my research to you view, but maybe more just as a playground for programming. A caveat to this result, though, many of these notebooks seem to be for course assignments, particularly machine learning courses. So when we go in and look at the descriptions that people put of these notebooks, the top keywords, once we clean them, are things like learning, machine, deep learning, project, Udacity, nano degree, Kaggle. And some of you may recognize these as popular online platforms for learning how to do machine learning, deep learning. So a couple notes. It may just be that students on these platforms don't care if somebody else can read their programming environment. They're just trying to get a result. Or it could be that the teachers of these classes don't really instill that you need to document what you're doing and what you're thinking as you do the analysis. Either way, this could contaminate the results some. So we said, all right, let's look at what some consider the creme de la creme, the prime use case for these notebooks, reproducible academic research, that rather than static papers, you can describe your research in a notebook. So we said maybe those notebooks that supplement academic publications will have more narrative. So on the right, this is a paper that came out of UCSD a couple of years ago, published in Nature Microbiology, some microbiome research. And they also released a set of notebooks on how they did every single step of this research. So what we did is we went back to our big corpus, our million notebooks, and we looked specifically for ones that were in collections of files that had a description file that linked to a published paper, that linked to a DOI link of that paper or an archive preprint, just some marker that this supplemented an academic publication. We combed through that by hand and then just tried to purposely sample from a bunch of disciplines. Let's grab some machine learning ones. Let's grab some ones from astronomy. Let's grab some ones from genetics. And then we selected about 150 of those to look at it detail from 50 repositories. So you can imagine 50 academic papers and the about 3 notebooks on average that go along with each paper. And I and another research assistant read through each of these notebooks, and for each block of text tried to code by hand, what is this text doing? What is it here for? Is it just describing the steps of the analysis? We ran a PCA. We tried to see if it was log normal. We tried to do this. Was it describing reasoning? The reason we're doing this kind of a check is because we can't do this kind of analysis unless it's normally distributed. Or is it describing the results? If you look at this graph, what you'll notice is there's an anomaly here. So when we did this hand coding, the first thing we noticed was of all of the notebooks in this corpus, the 150, only about 3/4 had text that was anything more than just a header, just a title to the notebook. So of those 3/4 that had somewhat descriptive text, about 88% of those used the text somewhere to describe steps, but only about 1/3 used it for this higher level describing reasoning, why they did something, or interpreting results. So here we see, if we look at a little more qualitatively at what these notebooks are being used for, even in this academic case, it's not being used for rich description. It's simply a labeling of the steps of the analysis. And it can be really hard to replicate an analysis if you just see they did a PCA, but you don't know why they did that. So to try and understand, from these 2 dimensions, why we're seeing that these notebooks aren't being used to clearly communicate research in the way that we're expecting or that commentators are expecting, we did a 3rd study where we interviewed data analysts. So we grabbed 15 analysts from around our campus, range of experience levels, different labs, so computational biology, pharmacology, astronomy. And then we just simply asked them to show us a notebook they've been working on recently, walk us through the structure of that notebook, talk about who else had access to it. And there were a couple of nuggets we got out of this interview data to help explain why the notebooks we saw were so messy, had so little documentation of reasoning or results. One was that people just viewed the notebooks as personal. Like, this is my personal programming environment. I don't think other people are going to be able to follow my programming style or understand why I did things. Why would I show it to them? So one said, a notebook is a very personal thing. So even if I would say, okay, here, lab mate, please look into it, it wouldn't be very helpful because it's very much reflecting my style and my programming style. And this resonates with prior research that shows many analysts, even in collaborative labs, don't share their script files. They just replicate it or recreate it. Another big finding was that everyone we talked to, without being prompted, said, my notebooks are really messy, and we're kind of embarrassed about this. So they said, analyses are iterative. Over time, it just kind of gets away from me. I have a hard time figuring out how I got to this end result. I'm not going to show somebody else how the sausage was made. I'm just going to send the final figure and hope they don't ask too many questions. So they said things like, mine feels like a mess. Mine feels like if somebody else looked at it, they wouldn't have any idea what order I ran the code in or like why I did things. Others said it's not how I strive for them to be, contains ugly code, or my favorite, there's dirty tricks that I did in there that I have to clean out. I mean, I know the result will still be the same, but still, I don't want anyone to see that. On the flip side, people said, yeah, but I can clean it up. I can make it like those ones that we dream about having for a couple of reasons. Either for my own sanity, to make it easier to navigate a really long notebook. So say I try to document at least the tasks because it's so easy to get lost in all the different specific questions I'm trying to answer with this analysis. So I'll just put in question before all the steps of code to do it. Or another analyst who is in more of a consulting role, where labs would come to her with a data set and she'd have to send the analysis back, said, well, really, I have to put in the explanation of what I'm doing if they're to understand what's going on. It's tedious, but it's kind of the whole point. So she says, the thing I usually end up having to put in, it's tedious, but it's kind of the whole point is, what are the conclusions that I drew, the interpretation? That's not something that can ever be auto-generated. So this speaks to why we saw so little of this in the academic notebooks we looked at. It's just a tedious process to stop and reflect. What am I doing? What do these results mean? And write it. When you really just want to do the next turn on the crank in the iteration cycle to see if you can improve the result. And we had another participant who really validated this, saying it's mostly lab meetings and then actually writing the paper that are the only times where you have to sit and be like, why am I doing this? What am I going to do? What am I finding? What do I think it means? And so my collaborators and I really think this shows a tension in data analysis between exploring data which is iterative and messy and generates a lot of byproducts and can be hard to understand, and then stopping to reflect and explain the process. And while we have this vision of this document that can mix that iterative, messy writing code with the more thoughtful explaining, there's this tension here that's just hard to get over. So we have to figure out how can we redesign this environment so people are more likely to write clear notebooks that are easier to use for research. This led to the second line of work, which I'm going to try and breeze through a little bit more quickly just to get to some of the more clinical applications. But in this line of work, we said, how might we encourage just make it easier to turn messy notebooks into cleaner ones? And we took a particular point of view. There's a lot of ways you can do this, but we said, can we make it immediately beneficial to do this cleaning? Can we make it so it's easier to navigate the notebook or to track your versions if you do a little bit of cleaning? And that way you might be more likely at the very end to have a clean notebook that you're willing to share with others. So in order to do that, we built a really simple extension that simply lets you fold portions of the notebook that you think you don't need at this time. So we're back with my plotting notebook. Let's say I say the first two cells here, I don't really need to see right now. I can click on these, click a button, and they'll hide. And I can name this hidden section. This is my imports and data section. If I click on this, it'll open up to the side for me, and I can look at those details. But if I don't need to see it, I can just collapse it and have a table of contents view. So we wanted to see, does this lead to people writing cleaner notebooks, making it easier to reuse somebody else's notebooks? We ended up running two studies, one a more controlled lab study where we had data science undergrads use the tool and saw that in some cases they were able, with the folding, to more quickly continue an analysis somebody else had done. So this kind of collaborative case, if I do the analysis, I hand it off to an undergrad who's working with me, and in the folded case, it's easier for them to work with that notebook. I want to focus a little bit on the second one, though, again, for sake of time. So let me just scroll to that portion. So for the second one, what we did is we did a technology probe, which in HCI, human-computer interaction, just refers to releasing an early-stage technology to see how people will use it, what other features they may want, how it changes how they interact with others in their work. So we had a really small sample, just 3 analysts from different labs on our campus, but we had them use this folding tool that we called GitHub for several weeks. Just in your normal everyday work, your normal analyses, not a contrived test, just use it and see if it's helpful. And then we interviewed them at the end of each week. And they came back with some feedback about what worked, what didn't, said it's really helpful for doing the analysis, because before I'd have 7 or 8 plots that all look the same, and I'd mix up which one I'm working on, but now I can hide everything except the one I'm working on currently. But the thing I think was most interesting was how they talked about it helped them with collaboration, that they were able to take a messy notebook, quickly clean it up, and then use it when talking with a colleague. So one of the things they told us, let's see if I can get the clicker working again, was that at baseline, using the standard software without folding, that presenting from notebooks in a context like this or in a lab meeting was just painful. They wanted to do it. They wanted to be able to show the full steps of an analysis, but they just had trouble doing so. So they said, when I presented versions of this notebook in our weekly meetings, I'm always scrolling. It's long, and people get distracted. Or another said, it's all slide decks now. We've tried, but we haven't had much success using these notebooks as a presentation tool. We've given up on that. They're just too long. There's too much in there to make it useful. On the flip side, though, when they used this folding tool, Janice, it made it easier to quickly just clean up the notebook, use it in a lab meeting, and if they needed to, they can look at the details. But they could say, well, I can kind of just quickly scroll through the notebook and know that every cell that's still left is a cell that I wanted to show for some reason. So again, I breezed through the second section, but we tried to show that we can reduce this tension between generating a bunch of mess and reflecting and cleaning it up by making it easy not only to mix code and descriptive text, but also quickly rearrange it, quickly fold and hide sections so you can reuse the same artifact both for your messy exploratory work and quickly explaining it to someone else. Now, the last bit of my research that has a more clinical focus was saying, okay, there's obviously some challenges with mixing live action data analysis in the very same document that you use to document it, mixing that reflective documentation and the action. We get this tension. But there's also some real benefits. And there's a reason why millions of people have in the last couple of years adopted this platform for data analysis. is there a way that we can make this paradigm of mixing documentation and action useful for people who don't program in other contexts, but still interact with a bunch of data? I looked at clinicians, but you can imagine engineers or government workers who are trying to interact with the data set. So we had this broad notion, kind of theoretical level. What about non-programmers, i.e. those who don't know a general programming language like Python or R? How might we enable them to mix analytical steps with their commentary and results? And I'll demonstrate one approach using a domain-specific language applied to clinical records. So this was work I did with the Veterans Medical Research Foundation several years ago. And this was back at a time where before the VA awarded the contract for updating their medical records to Cerner, they said, well, maybe we'll try and redesign these things on our own. So they had given a research grant to this group to say, help us think about what might we want to do with that new medical record system? How could we redesign it to be more useful? So it was seeking to redesign this legacy system, Vista CPRS. And one of the things that this group noticed that has been documented elsewhere is that medical records are often fragmented, and that can make them difficult to navigate and use. Specifically, there's kind of a divide between structured information, say demographic information, orders, family history, problem lists, that lives as structured data, and then the unstructured information, clinical notes, where you might reference that structured information, but not in as structured a way. And so people have tried to make it easier to move data back and forth between these two forms with things like dot phrases, where you can say, let me pull in all the demographic information and just populate it in the notes, or the orders, or the problem history. But this group said, well, what if we went the other way? What if we let clinicians write in the note, and then we parse the text in real time to generate structured data? Would that be helpful? Would that reduce double documentation time or navigation time? They look specifically at parsing medication orders. And I'm going to jump over. This was based off of some of their prior work, showing that clinicians spend a lot of time in notes and then the orders section, and that they spend a lot of time transitioning between the notes and the orders. So a bunch of their time and a bunch of the switches in the interface went between those two sections. What I helped this group do was prototype just a dead simple web interface to test this simple idea. So most of this is boilerplate, just a fake, too simple medical record. In the middle, we have a text editing section where they can start writing, say, a SOAP note, so a clinical note. What's going on here is as soon as the clinicians type a specific keyword, in this case, #med, what we're going to do is open up a drop-down, almost search dialog. You can imagine Google search. And we've connected them to their back-end database, their formulary of what medications they can order. So they can start typing things like simvastatin. They can just tab complete or hit the down arrow to complete that. Then we'll show them what dosages we have of that in the formulary. And then they can just keep typing. And I know this is hard to see, so I'll just zoom in. What's going on is as they're typing here, above it we have these little blue blobs of text that are saying, this is the part of the order that we're recognizing, the structured data that we're pulling out in real time. And then above it in the actual note, we're just placing exactly what they've written in there. So they can use whatever shorthand they want, and we'll try and parse it. So at the end, they hit enter at the end of this kind of search box, and they now have this structured text data in here that can be free text, but we're parsing it to structured data. And what this buys them is when they go to place the order, most of that information that we've parsed is already there. There may be a thing or two that they have to check, but they can largely just sign the order and not have to document, I want to start the patient on this, and then go and have to enter that via drop-downs later. We had a couple questions about how this might work. This is just a prototype system exploring this idea. So we want to see what types of shorthand would clinicians use. If we're going to build an ontology, something on top of RxNorm to parse all of the shorthand, like ASA for aspirin, how big does that ontology have to be? Is it just going to be an untractable problem? Or is it a pretty limited set of things we're going to have to recognize? What other functionality might clinicians want? Now, this is a seed of an idea, but what else does it make them think of that they may want in a record that mixes both documentation and taking action, placing orders? And then do clinicians just even see this as useful? We as researchers think it might be, but with their experience in day-to-day practice, is it even useful for them? So we did a quick usability study with 8 clinicians. gave them 2 patient scenarios where they had to write a basic SOAP note and then order 4 medications. And we tell them the medication order in this way, trying to be mostly free text, and just see how they would place this order in the note. So the first question, just what shorthand they used. We noticed that for certain parts of the order, like the medication, the dose, the form, and the route, the shorthand they used was pretty standardized. So if they were going to say, take it orally, they'd say PO or oral, but there weren't a lot of different variations, at least in our small set. However, for things like schedule, the quantity of the medication, the number of refills, or how to pick it up, things that clinicians said they often don't put in the interface anyway, there was just a whole bunch of different ways that they tried to input this. So that part of the ontology of trying to recognize that from free text could be really difficult. There would be a lot of different things that we'd have to differentiate between. As for what additional functionality this made clinicians think of, it really validated the benefit of mixing documentation with being able to take action directly in the note, not having to go to another screen. So they said things like additional parsing. It'd be great to parse active problems. I can just sit down, chat with the patient, look at them, and start typing. And if that just parsed what I was typing to structure data for the problem list, that'd be great. Or what about information retrieval? Not just inputting structured information, but pulling it back the other way like other systems do. Being able to just type, retrieve most recent colonoscopy, and have a summary pop up in the note, that would be great. And then lastly, they validated that this direction, this mixing of documentation and structured data entry and retrieval was really beneficial. So saying, I love not having to go out of the screen to place orders. The thing that I really like about this is having the order directly tied to the documentation. So in this case, we show a domain-specific language, really just a small language for parsing medication orders, can be used to design this notebook for non-programmers, this notebook that mixes free text with what looks like free text but is being parsed through structured data. And this is really just a markup language. So I'm going to, I think, jump over the thesis statements here because this isn't my dissertation defense and also implications, just to some what I think are interesting future directions. So I mentioned domain-specific languages as a way to enable people who don't program to still interact with data. And in the HCI community, one of the really interesting trends that's come out recently is being able to do data analysis via chat. And so in this case, what they have is this chat window here, and then off to the right is a panel where you can see results of the analysis. So in the chat, the user is basically saying things like, I want to analyze the flower data set. And it'll ask, oh, I noticed 4 flower data set files on your computer. Which one did you want? Oh, I wanted the 3rd one. How did you want to analyze it? Compare 2 sets? Do you want a t-test or an ANOVA? And then would link to materials on that. But you could just type via chat what you were wanting to do, and then it would turn that into the code necessary to do the analysis. And then on the clinical side, I think there's a lot more room, although there's certain barriers with vendors or regulation, but a lot more room for innovating on medical records to say, how can we make the clinical note, the documentation, more active? So folks like at the Regenstrief Institute have already done similar things to what the group I work with prototyped, where they notice in the note that you mentioned amoxicillin, so they pull up in a sidebar, do you want to order amoxicillin? And then there was also a system several years ago by Lauren Wilcox at Columbia that did data retrieval. So it would notice you mentioned arterial blood pressure in the note. If you hit enter after that, it's going to open a side panel where we're going to plot the arterial blood pressure data for the last couple days. And you can select data that you want to pull into the note. So I think with that, I will stop because I have been talking here for a while and just open up the floor for questions and comments. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. I think probably most clinical people in the room can see a lot of value of this. One of the things that sometimes happens, and I wonder if your research looked at this, is things that are obvious, great solutions to relatively common situations break down when situations get more complex. I can't remember where I was. I don't know if it was in this conference or somewhere about someone had some system that was great for putting in orders until it came to tapering steroids.
Yeah, it was a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. Were your cases complex enough to look at what might happen when things didn't fit into your narrow paradigm, so that the time people might save from the straightforward cases could be a lot more difficult in a more complex situation?
So we tried to vary the cases, and I'd have to look back at the actual ones that we used to give you a better answer on the variability there. But I do think that's a valid concern of, like, we may have made it easier to do 80% of things, but if this system then makes it harder to do that tail of 20%, and much harder to where you're now wasting a bunch of time trying to figure out, because in this system we don't give a lot of feedback. We do have a drop-down system that you could fall back on, but that was kind of harder to discover. So I think the question is, if you can make it easier for the everyday case, how do you make sure that it's not just painfully difficult for the case that still comes up once a week? And I don't have a lot of data on that, but I do think that's one of the real challenges here. Yeah. Yeah.
So, thanks for a nice talk. I was really interested in the first part where you showed the survey of the programmers, and well, they say they're not. This is actually my point. That these scientists, they're saying that they don't want to share their notebooks. They're too messy. They have to fix this. They have to fix that. They're kind of complaining about all the things that quote unquote real programmers who develop in a team have to do, but they're kind of making the excuse that they're not real programmers, so they shouldn't have to, but really they are programming, and really they do have to do these things. And as more and more science is essentially done computationally with programs, and it's so easy to make mistakes, like not selecting all the cells in the spreadsheet and all that. I guess the question is a bit larger. It seems like we're at a point where there is really a necessary culture change, and people who are doing science have to inherit some of the discipline that comes from programming and other things. And so I just was wondering, what you thought, being an HCI person, about, how much of that is new and better tools, how much of that is education and re-education. How do we get the people that are doing science to be fastidious about their programming and the shareability of that, so that we can actually reproduce the science and have some confidence in it? Because I'll tell you right now, with all this stuff, and especially what you showed me, my confidence in the science that's published now has dropped because they don't want to show anybody their stuff, and they believe it'll work. That was a really nice quote. I need to have to change this and get rid of this hack, but I know it'll still have the same result.
Yeah.
How do you know it'll have the same result? That's a completely fallacious.
Discipline that, like, bench scientists have, presumably taken upon themselves, right? Lab members.
Yeah. So.
Like, they have that. Presumably, they're embodying that
Right.
discipline, and you're suggesting that computationalists pretty much just have to, like, put their adult hats
Well,
on it.
I'm asking, the person who wants to, pursue this as research and impact the way science is done computationally, what do we think we need to do to bring that discipline into, computational bioscience, so that we don't have this wacky Wild West of unselected cells and differing, and I know that was economics, but we know this happens in biology too.
So a couple comments. One, back to the, comparing to wet lab work. One of our participants actually brought that. Well, I'll get there. But one of our participants brought up and saying, it's only really when I publish the paper that I go back to think that this is so different than my chem lab days, where I had a very specific way, disciplined way that I had to record the analysis and the steps of the study. And I just don't do that in this computational system. To your question, I think there's a mix of things we can do. One, there's programs like software carpentry or data carpentry that go around and try and train those in the sciences how to do scientific computing with some rigor. So using things like version control, unit testing, those kinds of things. I think there's some that we can do on the interface side. So things like, hey, you've run 5 different tests on this data set now. you're diluting your p-value, essentially. So if you're going to come out and say that this is significant, you just run a whole bunch of tests until you found one that was. Those are kinds of things that we can track. I do think a lot of it has to be at the cultural level, though, both on the educational training side and then the lab expectations. As an example, I showed earlier, I think it was a Nature Biology or Microbiology paper that came out of a lab at UC San Diego. That lab has essentially half of the lab that focuses on the biology and microbiome work, and another half that really acts as a software development group. They sit down and they do code reviews. They're writing unit tests and all these things that you would see in a software development group, and that's their expertise and contribution to science.
Have there been any studies, or is there any data that shows an actual outcome impact in this? I mean, you know, and I'm familiar with software carpentry, and other faculty here are really involved with that. But do we actually have data that shows that, you know, science is more reproducible, or there are less mistakes, or do we have any?
I don't think we even have a baseline to be able to say that we're improving it.
Seems like we need that.
Yeah. Fair.
So you showed near the end of your talk, by the way, great talk. I learned a ton. Giving a verbal command to compare this to that. So and you just mentioned that there should be some kind of decision support in there. So I'll give an example. 20 years ago when I was working at a health system, I had a doctor say to me, I want you to compare the mortality after cabbage for this hospital versus that hospital. I knew not to do that because of the risk adjustment that had to be done, and he just wanted a straight comparison. So is there any kind of, you mentioned the correcting for P, and I can see where people who aren't trained strongly in science and programming, kind of like what Aaron was saying, might ask it to do comparisons that could be misleading. So is there any of that kind of guidance in there with these tools?
There's not much of that guidance in there now that I know of. I think it's an interesting question, especially in educational contexts, if you can use tools like this to provide guidance. So you can imagine in a class where students are learning how to do data analysis, and we'll just do the p-value dilution thing, that after they try checking the same data set 3 or 4 times, a pop-up comes up and says like, hey, do you know what this is? This is going on. And it gives you a lot of information about why you don't want to do this. That's more pedagogical. For those who are more practicing data analysis, I would almost imagine something like computational spell check. So we get spell check that just lightly highlights, you might want to change this. This looks a little funky. The grammar's off. The spelling's off. And in that context, you may not want something yelling at you all the time that you do something it thinks is incorrect. Yeah, so grammar for coding practice. But just how can you make it lightweight so that you notice it, but it's not jumping in your face and stopping you from continuing. Like, yeah, I know that, but I already corrected for this. It just didn't register that I had done that. So I don't know of any work in that area yet, but I think that's a promising area, especially pedagogically, because that seems to be an area where it'd be easier to detect the common errors, and then you can channel it into a learning episode. It'd be really valuable.
I have 2 questions. They might be related. First is, how do you discern a case where an input for example, someone is writing a note or something like that, and you try to link it to an order or something like that, but it's not clear enough what they wanted, or maybe it says insufficient amount of data that was provided. How do you reconcile those situations? And the second question is, if there is if it's a little bit too ambiguous, or maybe there were just too many options to choose from, how do you limit or make sure that it's just not information overload for people who are trying to use that function?
Yeah. So the first problem you mentioned is the Midas touch problem, at least how it's referred to in a lot of HCI communities, at least as I understand the problem you're describing, where essentially if you have the system always on or always recognizing, it's like Midas always touching things and turning to gold, even when you didn't intend for that thing to happen. So that's where you build in a clutch to basically say, okay, now engage this parsing and recognition, now disengage it. So in our case, that's why we had you have to type #med first to be able to say, okay, this is a medication I'm doing. We wanted it to be lightweight and still with your hands on the keyboard rather than clicking something. So it was just a quick invoke. I'm going to place a medication order. and then hit enter to turn it off. And that was our way of building a collection so that it's not just always parsing all the time. The other way that you can do it is like the medical gopher system. It doesn't act on it. It just, on the side panel, says, it looks like you wanted to do this. Is this what you wanted to do? And you can click on it. And that's another way to address the second problem you brought up of what if it's just ambiguous? And that's where research in domain-specific languages has said, does there need to be one-to-one mapping? Can there be one-to-many? And when there's a one-to-many mapping, how do you clarify? And so systems for like data cleaning, the data wrangler or trifactor system has done that, where you can select a way that you want to clean a data set. Your selection may be ambiguous, and so it'll say it looks like one of these 4 things. We went ahead and cleaned the data set in each of those 4 ways, and it looks like this way of cleaning it is going to lead to the cleanest data, so we rank that highest. So there's ways that you can do kind of predictive analytics in the background if it's ambiguous to say, you probably meant this. Is that correct? And then ask for them to select that. Yeah.
Thank you. Great talk. And I just want to say ahead before the question, great that you also put your webpage in the description. I was curious, when you found those articles that you looked at, like 145, I think, do you have an estimate how many of those were clinical, medical journals?
Oh, good question. I don't at this point. Again, it was from the data set that we had gotten, so folks who had posted on GitHub, and then trying to purposely sample for a diverse range. Mm-hmm. So I'd say probably relatively few are clinical journals, because it's things like astronomy, biology, machine learning that are using computational notebooks more than the medical journals. Like, I don't know that I've seen one going to JAMA or JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine that has a notebook attached to it. But I've seen more in like more hard, basic sciences, I guess.
Thank you. The reason why I'm asking is I think the culture change towards more transparency in the science is like really like the biggest challenge for this. And I'm suspecting from what I've been familiar with like the reproducible research for a couple of years now, but I've been keeping my eye out in medical journals and maybe seen once or twice something. And I honestly think that culture change has to go, at least in part, through the publishers, that they need to emphasize more like that they value that and they look for where like submissions where the decision making and the processing of the steps are like hidden or obfuscated versus where it's made transparent. The readers and the publishers ideally should get on board with this idea, and I'm just concerned that the medical field is probably going to lag behind other disciplines there for a while.
Yeah, so a note on that. I mean, I agree with some of that sentiment, although I think there's more complexity in that it's easier if you're in astronomy to make your work reproducible because there's no human subjects data involved. But you can just post your whole data set. Who cares? Hey, it's even better if somebody cites it. You're just looking at asteroids or points of light. And so there are other barriers to reproducibility beyond writing it clearly or having a platform that are things like, how do I clean the data? How do I share it? So things like homomorphic encryption and those things that have really been pioneered in the medical context, I think are some of the blocking barriers. Yes, there's some culture change issues, but I think it's easier in some of the other fields to do that. I mean, for me, I ended up posting my full data set of all million notebooks online. And the only way I could do that is because I had scraped data from GitHub in the first place. It was a public repository in the first place. If it wasn't that way, it's very hard for me to post any kind of human subjects data. Like my interview data, it's hard to post that online. Follow up.
Just a quick follow-up. I agree with that. There are different extents to which you can make it transparent, but still there is something to be said, at least for making the steps, the algorithms that you used for your statistical processing. Even if you cannot publish the data, every reader will understand. If you publish the steps that you went through in your statistical analysis, it still allows a critical evaluation, more so than if it's just enumerated and most of the details are obfuscated.
So I was just going to make the comment that the point that Dr. Cohen brought up that was about computational people taking on the same discipline that bench scientists have trained themselves to do in terms of a lab notebook. But I tie that back into the statistic you showed about all the notebooks that only have code and no documentation, and having to do with courses. And so what we're seeing there is that a lot of these are probably homework assignments, or they're exercises. And so the goal is like, use this function, here's the thing, run this machine learning model on it, see what you get, make the graph. And that's the homework assignment. So you do that, right? And you're done. So maybe that's the place that you start instilling that discipline is that the instructors need to start adding the requirement that things be documented. As having been an instructor, that greatly will increase the burden on the graders of what they have to do. But anyway, it seems like you kind of identified where that, at least one place where that could begin is in that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
One last question. It really might be more of a comment, but I'm intrigued. You mentioned a second use case for medical records, which is pulling in data and summarizing things, and whether that's a potential solution to one of the biggest problems with the text in medical records, of the proliferation of copy and paste, whether instead people can basically, paste in a link, or maybe ideally, like the first, 3 sentences, with a ... and then they could click and then go get the whole report, which would be more explicit that they're copying and pasting. But a lot of people do copy and paste because the entry of data is so time-consuming.
Yeah, no, the system that Lauren Wilcox built while at Columbia, she's now at Georgia Tech, address that by using transclusion, which is really just linking to where that data came from. So it would even do things like you could write in, okay, arterial blood pressure is this thing right now, but update me if it goes above or below this range, or update it every 12 hours in the note. And so there's issues with, you have to figure out, is this supposed to be just a once and for all record? Is it supposed to be a living document? You get into some hairy trade-offs there, but there are ways to, as you say, just kind of peek or link to or give an appetizer as to the information that's over there. And if you really want to, using that folding feature, you can expand it and look at it, but you don't need to see the whole thing. So, yeah. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate the comments.